Great, 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 great. Thank you for being here. Welcome to my presentation. My name is Jason Holmes. My presentation and my dissertation is currently titled From Pathway to Performance, English Proficiency Pathways and Academic Achievement in Canadian Universities. I'm from the Faculty of Education at York University. As I'm sure many of those in this room are aware of, international students are an incredibly important to Canadian higher education and Canadian society in general. They contribute financially in terms of a significant contribution of university revenue. They contribute culturally. They contribute economically in terms of their labor, their off-campus spending, just to highlight a few. If international students want to study in Canada, they have to meet university admission requirements, just as a domestic student would. However, they typically have to demonstrate their English language proficiency if they come from a country where English is not the primary language spoken. There are two main ways or two main pathways to demonstrate English language proficiency. Standardized testing route, mostly represented by the International English Language Testing System, the IELTS, or the Test of English as a Foreign Language, TOEFL. These are the most common. They're used in many capacities in many different institutions across the world. However, a secondary pathway is the offering of English language courses by often the universities themselves. These take the form of English for Academic Purpose Programming often, so EAP. Now, admission at a university typically assumes that both of these pathways are equally effective at assessing English language proficiency and thereby ensuring that international students have the necessary English language proficiency to succeed in English medium instruction. There's a very broad literature on academic success or student success. There's various predictors of academic success. There is significant research on the academic achievement of international students who meet these admission requirements through different standardized tests. So, for example, performance on the IELTS, higher performance on the IELTS equating to higher levels of academic outcomes or better academic outcomes. And what those outcomes are is varied, but we'll kind of go over that. However, there's a very significant gap comparing academic achievement of international students who meet English language proficiency requirements through different pathways, namely comparing the course-based or EAP pathway to the various testing pathways. As such, my dissertation examines how the different ways international students meet English language requirements, like taking tests, for example, or completing university courses, impact their academic success at two universities. Raises a question. It's how do international students admitted through different ELP pathways compare in terms of their academic achievement, specifically at the end of the first year of study? And how do these differences vary when we account for different scores on the tests themselves? So, for example, a score of 8.5 on an IELTS versus the score of like a 5.5 on an IELTS. The data for this dissertation came from two universities, as I mentioned. This is representative of post-data cleaning. So for University A, the sample is over 10,000 students. For University B, the sample is over 2,500 students. They're both large research institutions, although located in different regions. Now, I've discussed academic achievement thus far. So for this presentation and for this component of my dissertation, this is operationalized as first-year cumulative GPA. And this data was collected over different time periods, but both universities provided this. They provided indicators of IELTS and TOEFL, and they provided their scores, student scores on these exams. And they provided indicators that students met admission requirements through the course-based pathway if they didn't meet them through the test-based pathway. And they provided various control variables: age, gender, country of origin, discipline of study. Now, speaking about English language proficiency pathway, this was coded into different categories based on score performance, as I alluded to. So students with low scores were found in the sample to have been admitted to university with scores below admission requirements. So for example, a low IELTS score of 5.5, whereas admission requirements were 6.5, but they were still admitted. So they were included and coded together as a low bucket. A medium range, which is meeting admission requirements. So for example, an IELTS score of 6.5, just right at admission requirement. And then a high score surpassing admission requirements. So an IELTS score of an 8.5 out of 9, for example. And then of course, the EAP pathway was coded as the reference group, or the group that the test scores would be compared to. This study employs multiple regression, which is a statistical method used to understand the relationship between a dependent variable, and in this case, that's cumulative GPA, and two or more independent variables. So in this case, that's English language proficiency pathway and all the control variables that I've mentioned. And this method helps understand and determine how the independent variables contribute to predicting the dependent variable while controlling for the effects of other variables. So for example, discipline of study, country of origin, etc. Now on to the findings. So this graph shows the results of the regression analyses for the two different universities presented together with all the variables included in the model. So all the controls are included in this representation. The x-axis represents different English language proficiency levels from low proficiency, for example, an IELTS of 5.5 to 6, to a high proficiency. So for example, an IELTS score of 8.0 to 9.0. The y-axis shows the predicted difference in cumulative GPA for each English proficiency pathway compared to the EAP pathway. Put in a different way, this graph shows the predicted difference in first-year cumulative GPA between each test score range in comparison to EAP at University A, represented by this blue line, and University B, represented by this green line, where the X's, or the red X's, are statistically significant differences. So to give you a more concrete example, at University A, students admitted to university with an IELTS score between 8.0 and 9.0 had a cumulative GPA about 1.0 higher than those who were admitted through the EAP pathway. And this difference is statistically significant. At University A, most testing score ranges, so here, 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 and here, resulted in cumulative statistical significance, and most resulted in cumulative GPA higher than those who were admitted through EAP pathway, especially at the high level, as I've highlighted. Only one pathway, the mid-ranged TOEFL, resulted in a lower GPA compared to the EAP group. This is statistically significant, but the difference here is very minor. It's only about a 0.3 GPA difference, cumulative GPA difference. At University B, this trend is a lot more stable, so we don't see this big spike, with some pathways performing slightly higher than the EAP pathway here and here, but it's less pronounced. You don't have this, this gap is quite significant. Both universities, however, demonstrate that students admitted with higher English language proficiency pathways tend to perform better academically compared to those submitted who were admitted through EAP. So this cluster here, higher scores at both universities. But there is significant variation and more pronounced differences at University A than B. So there's this gap here, a little bit of a pronounced difference between these two institutions. So the health of the model, or what the interpretation of the model, the R-squared values. R-squared values are simply how well a regression model explains variation in the data. In simpler terms, it just tells us a percentage of the change in academic achievement, how much the change in academic achievement can be predicted by the English language proficiency pathway and the other factors. So typically, a higher R-squared value means the model is doing a better job of explaining the variation in academic achievement. At University A, the R-squared value was 7.4. At University B, the R-squared value was 2.9. These are low. So the findings suggest that other factors not included in this dissertation, not gender, not age, not country of origin, not discipline of study, not pathway, are better predictors of cumulative GPA. While some English language proficiency pathways did show statistical significant outcomes compared to EAP, overall, English language proficiency pathway does not strongly predict academic achievement on its own while controlling for the various factors that I attempted to control for. Implications of these findings are a challenge to the assumption that all English language proficiency measures are equivalent. Universities may reconsider this assumption of equivalency between standardized tests themselves, equivalency between the IELTS and the TOEFL, and equivalency between the standardized testing pathway and the course-based pathway. Given the findings also suggest, because of the difference between the two lines, that EAP programs themselves might vary in quality or rigor. Specifically, like University B had less difference, and University A had much more difference. So something's going on perhaps in the EAP program at University A. So if this might affect academic outcomes of students in those EAP programs. This might, enhancing the content effectiveness of EAP programs might be necessary, for example. There are also differences between these two institutions that I couldn't cover in this presentation. Demographics of students, the disciplines represented in the sample. This might explain some of the results. For future research, a longitudinal study, this study used first-year cumulative GPA, looking over time, graduation rates, for example, time to degree completion, would further assess the impact of this pathway on student outcomes over a longer period of time and use a different dependent variable than GPA. I would like to do a qualitative analysis, actually looking at the perspectives of students that go through these different pathways. And I also would like to talk to professors themselves to hear their perspectives of how students are prepared or not prepared for instruction in English, depending on the pathway that they go through. And of course, I attempted to do I did do a cross-institutional study, but more institutions, different contexts, different regions, different types of institutions perhaps would be interesting. Some key takeaways. So higher English language proficiency test scores, specifically those ranges of IELTS and TOEFL, they outperformed EAP significantly, demonstrating that higher standardized test scores predict higher academic achievement when compared to EAP. At the mid-range, so students who met admission requirements but close to the requirement, they typically showed better performance than EAP, but it's less drastic. The difference is less drastic. The effect on GPA is less drastic. Still statistically significant generally, but it's less severe. And of course, further research on the long-term academic success and graduation rates of students who go through these different routes and then comparing them would be quite valuable, and there is quite a significant gap in that comparison component. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.